Have you ever wondered what happens when a girl from the wrong side of town dares to touch something the world told her wasn't hers? When 15-year-old Imani Brooks placed her fingers on that grand piano, one that cost more than her family's yearly income, she wasn't trying to prove anything. She was just curious. But in a room full of privilege, curiosity can look like audacity. And audacity, it doesn't sit well with power. What followed was a humiliation so public, so personal, that any normal teenager would have walked away in shame. But Imani wasn't normal. She was exceptional. And what no one in that elite music academy knew, what even Imani herself didn't fully realize, was that the melody she carried wasn't just skill, it was survival. This is the story of how a self-taught girl from Newark, raised by a single mom working back-to-back shifts, silenced a room full of skeptics with nothing but her hands, her heart, and a second-hand pair of headphones. A girl who went from being mocked as a charity case to becoming the reason Brightmoor Conservatory rewrote its entire curriculum. In the next few minutes, you'll follow Imani's journey, from community center keyboards to London concert halls, from being told don't touch what you can't afford to teaching the very people who once doubted her. You'll witness the rise of someone who didn't break the rules. She just played a different song. And by the time we reach the end, we won't just be asking how she got here. We'll be asking why she had to fight so hard to be seen in the first place. From a professional's lens, what Imani Brooks did wasn't just rare. It was system-breaking. She didn't only perform music. She exposed how talent gets overlooked when it doesn't come dressed in a bow tie or backed by a resume. And she forced an institution to ask itself, what are we really listening to? Notes or names? So stay with us, because this story won't just move you. It'll change how you see talent, education, and the quiet revolutions happening in rooms no one thought to watch. If this kind of story speaks to you, if you believe in underdogs, comebacks, and justice that doesn't need applause, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next twist in the stories we tell. Because trust us, this one, you'll want to hear till the last note. Newark, New Jersey, Monday morning. It wasn't raining, but the street outside Imani Brooks' house was still wet, as if someone had cried through every corner of the neighborhood. The red brick buildings stood hunched together like they were clinging to each other for warmth in the damp early spring chill. An ambulance blared past the square where just 4 days ago, someone had been stabbed outside a corner store. A diagonal crack cut across Imani's bedroom window, a scar left by last winter's storm. But she hadn't told her mom yet. Her mom would worry, and she already had enough on her plate. Imani sat curled in front of her old keyboard, bare feet tucked under a plastic stool. In her lap was a notebook filled with hand-drawn music symbols in faint pencil. Next to it, a worn-out Samsung phone balanced on a ramen box to light her fingers while she played. The screen flickered whenever the Wi-Fi dipped. But Imani was used to playing in the dark. She played by memory, by feel, and by the calluses on her fingertips. Since the age of 7, she'd had an unexplainable love affair with music. It began with an old upright piano in St. Mary's Youth Hall, a rundown community center for underprivileged kids in South Newark. She had no teacher, no books, just headphones and a naive belief that music might one day take her far away from all this. That morning, she was in the tiny practice room, barely big enough for a wobbly-legged table and a piano missing 2 white keys. The sound came out warped, but she patiently adjusted her pressure to even it out. She was rehearsing a passage from Chopin's Ballad No. 1, a piece no one in her neighborhood had ever heard of, but she had in a YouTube video 2 years ago, a cover by a Japanese pianist. At first, she thought it was a mistake, a wordless piece long and tangled with notes. But then, it pulled her in, like a voice calling from another place, a world with no fences. She played it by ear, repeated, jotted things down, rewound the video when the Wi-Fi worked, and eventually, it became part of her bloodstream. The practice room door swung open. Imani came the voice of Mr. Alton Reed, warm, deep, and full of affection. "You've stunned me again." She stopped playing, startled. "You're early," she said, tugging out her earbuds awkwardly. He smiled, holding an ivory envelope. the kind most families around here only saw at libraries or churches during fundraisers. I have something for you. She took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a thick, gold-trimmed invitation, printed in elegant italics. Brightmoor Conservatory cordially invites Miss Imani Brooks to attend our annual open house and student showcase. Imani stared at the words like each one was a doorway, and she wasn't sure she had the key. How, how did they know about me? She asked, her voice barely more than a breath. Mr. Reed scratched his head and smiled sheepishly. I sent them your recording. An old friend of mine teaches there. He said he hasn't heard someone play Chopin without forcing it into a mold in years. He called you unprocessed, raw talent. Imani lowered her gaze. Her heart thudded. She had never imagined someone like her, frizzy-haired, faded t-shirt, living in a leaky apartment with creaky floors, would ever receive something described as cordially. That afternoon, her mother, Denise Brooks, came home after the night shift at the nursing home. Her dark green uniform smelled of disinfectant and sweat. She listened quietly. Then, without a word, she pulled 3 20s and a $10 bill from her wallet, placed them on the table and said, You need new shoes. We're not letting them see those blistered feet at the showcase. Imani turned away to hide her tears. Her mother, the woman who had given up a dream of becoming a teacher to raise 3 kids alone after her husband died, had always sacrificed in silence, as if that was the only way to survive. The next morning, they headed to the bus station together. They caught the Greyhound from Newark to Philadelphia. On the ride, Imani held the invitation close to her chest. She'd heard people say Brightmoor wasn't a school. It was a world built for the children of tycoons, diplomats, and renowned artists. She had looked it up online. A classical building with white columns like a museum, with its own recording studios. There, people didn't play music to survive. They lived to play music. By the time they arrived, a light drizzle was still falling. She and her mother stepped off the bus, the only ones wearing plastic raincoats and carrying cloth bags. Sleek black SUVs lined the entrance, from which children in mini suits stepped out, sheltered by nannies holding umbrellas. Her mother held her hand, eyes scanning the campus, voice calm. You're a Brooks, and Brooks don't back away from open doors. Imani nodded, sneaking a pair of dry socks from her bag. Not for fashion, just because the other ones had holes. She wanted to feel worthy, even if only for the first few steps. She entered the main hall. It looked like a miniature opera house, sparkling crystal chandeliers, ebony paneled walls, marble floors. And in the center, like a crown atop a throne, stood a grand black Steinway, its lid open like wings ready to take flight. Imani froze. It was the first time she'd ever seen a real piano. Not rusty, not chipped, not patched with tape. She stepped forward, drawn by the gravity of a dream. She gently placed one finger on a key, not pressing, just touching, and felt the entire universe fold into that moment. Then a voice cracked like a whip. Excuse me! A female voice, cold, precise, trained to criticize without raising volume. Imani yanked her hand back. Standing before her was Charlotte Aldridge. Platinum hair in a perfect bun, a black dress tailored like armor, eyes sharp as gemstones. That's a Steinway Model D concert grand worth $150,000. It's not for sightseeing tourists to paw at. Imani stepped back. Her face flushed. A group of students behind Charlotte giggled. One boy filmed. A girl stifled a laugh, not from shock, but delight. Charlotte stepped forward again. Let me guess. You play Heart and Soul? Or Chopsticks? Imani opened her mouth but couldn't speak. Her language was gone. All that remained was hurt. And then, a voice from behind. Miss Brooks is here by invitation. Everyone turned. It was Mr. Reed, still in his old blazer, silver hair slicked back, eyes warm despite the sneers around him. And I believe she has something to say. Charlotte smirked, chin tilted. Really? Then let her play. We could use a little entertainment. All eyes turned to Imani, the small girl in torn shoes, unstraightened curls, staring up at the piano. She swallowed. Her heart raced. And a part of her, the part that had spent 300 hours learning Chopin by ear, the part that had cried in silence when she couldn't find sheet music, the part that dreamed nightly of piano notes under a rusted tin roof, caught fire. She turned to her mother. Mrs. Brooks gave a single nod. No words. But that look, that was the key. Imani stepped forward. She adjusted the bench using a music theory book her mother had packed. She took a deep breath. Hands rested on the keys, and the world fell silent. No one in the Brightmoor Hall moved when Imani Brooks' first finger touched the piano key. Not because they were expecting something spectacular, but because every pair of eyes was waiting for a slip, a wrong note, a reason to confirm the assumptions they had already made. That's why no one blinked. They were hunting for failure. The first note rang out, low, round, and resonant, like a whispered statement full of quiet power. It wasn't the kind of flashy opening meant to impress. It sounded like an introduction, a tone that said the player wasn't forcing anything, but listening to the piano, searching for a shared voice. Charlotte Aldridge stood at the front with arms crossed, eyebrows slightly raised, as if waiting for Imani to stumble by the third note. But as the opening of ballad number 1 slowly unfolded, something began to shift. Imani wasn't looking at anyone, not even at her hands. Her eyes were closed, letting her mind guide her. The melody flowed, not by textbook rules, but by breath. Every motion was fluid, as if the Steinway itself were supporting her, not the other way around. The notes slipped through the marble grooves of the floor, bounced off the high ceiling, and settled into the hearts of the people watching. Parents who were holding champagne glasses now simply held them still. Blazer-clad students no longer leaned lazily against the wall. A few reached for their phones but then stopped. It felt like witnessing something sacred, and handheld devices didn't feel worthy of interrupting it. In the back row, a piano faculty member, Dr. Hallerman, leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "She's telling a story through the keys." Imani didn't know she had the whole room holding its breath. She was simply reliving every second that had stitched this piece together. The rainy nights when the roof leaked on her electric keyboard, the afternoons her mother skipped dinner just to give her more time to practice. The blue glow of her phone playing slowed-down tutorial videos at 0.25x speed. The tapping footsteps of her little brother running laps nearby. The words her grandmother once told her, "If you can't say it, play it. The kind ones will understand." And today she was playing, for every time she hadn't been allowed to speak. As the piece entered its core, the tug-of-war between dream and reality, Imani's posture shifted. Her back straightened. Her eyes opened. The notes cascaded in a blur, nearly breaching the limits of human agility. But this wasn't technical flair. It was emotion, unleashed. Charlotte's expression began to falter. She couldn't deny it. Imani wasn't just hitting the right notes. She was making the music breathe. The audience had stopped seeing her as a special case. They were being pulled in, guided, moved. And to Charlotte, that was a direct insult to the established order. A soft creak came from the chair of a parent leaning forward for a better view. Dr. Hallerman was no longer seated. He had stepped up close to the stage, hand gently to his chin, lips moving silently with each phrase. As Imani approached the ending, those scattered chords like final confessions, the entire hall felt like it was holding its breath underwater. The last note dropped. No sound followed. 3 seconds. 4, 5. The first applause came from the back. Mr. Reed, standing tall, eyes glistening. Then came Imani's mother, clapping with one hand while covering her mouth, tears streaming. And then, a wave of clapping rippled across the room, from the left, then the right, then the entire hall. Some stood, some scrambled for their phones too late, but many just stood still, not clapping, but watching. Not because they weren't moved, but because they were afraid. Afraid that what they had just witnessed defied explanation. Charlotte took a step back. She didn't understand. How could this be? A girl with no teacher, no formal training, no audition prep, had just made the entire room bow to her playing? That wasn't fair. She had spent 15 years mastering every technique, every finger pattern, every phrasing according to conservatory standards. And that girl had taken the stage using nothing but emotion. Dr. Marcus Reed, the chair of piano studies, stepped onto the stage. He bowed gently to Imani, then took the microphone. "This young lady," he said, "just reminded us why music still matters in this world. Not for awards, not for scholarships, but because it remains the one place where truth can be heard without anyone needing to speak. He turned to Imani. How long have you been playing piano? Since I was 7, Imani replied quietly. Any teachers? Not really, just YouTube and a few photocopied music books. The room buzzed. Dr. Reed looked at her again, tilting his head slightly. Can you play a Bach excerpt? Something you've never practiced before? Imani nodded. He handed her his phone, playing a 30-second audio clip. She listened, closed her eyes, and played it back. Not perfectly, but truthfully, and no one could deny it anymore. They had just met a prodigy. Charlotte muttered under her breath, "It's just one trick. Anyone can rehearse one piece." But this time, no one echoed her. Imani stood there, fingers still hovering above the keys, heart pounding. But she knew, for the first time in her life, her playing had touched something she once thought was off-limits to her: respect. And when Dr. Reed turned to the faculty and said, "We need to admit her into this conservatory, full ride, immediately," no one disagreed. One finger touched a key, and a whole world shifted. Right after Imani Brooks stepped away from the piano bench, the atmosphere inside Brightmoor Conservatory's hall hadn't quite returned to normal. The applause had stopped, the audience had sat back down, and the final contestants of the showcase were continuing their performances, but everyone felt as though the real event had already happened, and everything else was just an aftertaste. Imani stood on the sidelines, her hands still trembling from the echo of her performance, but there was no fear in her eyes anymore. They were lit, not from triumph, but because she had just broken through an invisible wall that had always kept her from better pianos, bigger stages, and more real dreams. Her mother, Denise Brooks, remained by the exit, eyes still wet, but with a steady smile. She didn't say anything, neither did Imani, but the space between them now belonged to two people who understood this simple truth. Today, her daughter didn't wait for anyone to open the door. She had broken the lock herself. Dr. Marcus Reed, the head of the piano department, with his salt and pepper hair and signature handkerchief always peeking from his blazer pocket, had quietly summoned the Brightmoor headmistress, Mrs. Adelaide Howell, to the corridor behind the stage. The exchange lasted only a few minutes, but when they returned, Mrs. Howell's expression had noticeably changed, from indifferent to attentive, from surprised to strategically evaluative. It was the look of an administrator who had just seen a rare gem, not only for its inherent worth, but for the social impact it could create. "Imani Brooks," she said, approaching the small girl leaning against a marble column. "Would you mind giving me a moment?" Imani nodded, light as a bird gliding midair, too cautious to land. Mrs. Howell looked to Imani's mother. "Ms. Brooks, I believe your daughter has just given us a valuable lesson, and I believe it's time we offer her a fitting opportunity." Then she turned back to Imani. "We'd like to invite you to submit an official application this coming week, with full financial aid, covering everything Brightmoor can provide." That sentence, if spoken elsewhere, in a scholarship office, a library, or via email, might have sounded like a generous offer. But here in this very hall, under the gaze of those who had once looked down on her, it was a blow dealt to the outdated architecture of privilege. And the first person to reject it, naturally, was Charlotte Aldridge. She stepped forward, the sound of her heels clicking lightly against the marble floor like a countdown. "With all due respect," Charlotte began, precisely calmly, "Brightmoor has a long-standing process. There are students who've trained their entire lives, who've waited years to get in. One performance, no matter how moving, shouldn't override that." No one replied, but that didn't mean people weren't thinking. A parent on the left side gave a subtle nod. A student shot Charlotte a furtive glance of approval, but Mrs. Howell, unaccustomed to being pressed, replied softly, "Charlotte, you're not wrong, but your great-grandfather also once received a special scholarship when he was just a miner's son in West Virginia. History favors no one. It simply reminds us that opportunity was never meant to be exclusive." That sentence sliced into the name Aldridge, a family whose legacy was literally engraved on the conservatory's concert hall. Charlotte went silent. Her once confident eyes wavered, like a riverbank starting to erode. Mr. Reed stepped forward, placing a hand on Imani's shoulder. "Thank you," he said, "for not running away." She smiled, small but enough to reveal that confidence was no longer something she needed to borrow from others. After the showcase, students were invited to tour the classrooms, recording studios, and the library. Imani and her mother were guided by a sophomore student. When they entered practice room 4, home to the latest grand piano model, she gently placed her hand on the lid. This time, no one stopped her. She didn't play a note, but her presence in that room, after everything that had happened, was already a piece of music in itself. Down the hallway in a quiet corner, Charlotte sat beside her best friend, Victoria Lennox, the only one who hadn't left her side after her fall from grace. "She's not even trained," Charlotte muttered, her voice stripped of its usual confidence, tinged now with fear. "What if this becomes a trend? One emotional performance, and all our years mean nothing," Victoria responded softly. "Or maybe we finally have to admit that raw talent is a threat to curated privilege." Charlotte said nothing. The first crack in the wall of privilege hadn't come from outside. It came from within, when those inside began to question the fairness of where they stood. That evening, Imani and her mother returned to Newark on the same Greyhound they came on. She leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, silent the entire ride. When they stepped into their old apartment, the scent of dinner her mother had prepared earlier still lingered in the air. But Imani wasn't hungry. She opened her small bookshelf, took out the old yellow notebook, and wrote on the last page, "Today they learned my name, but tomorrow they'll know my sound." And just like that, the first key had turned. A door had opened, and someone, once mocked for touching the piano, was now lifted by that very instrument onto a higher stage. 3 days after the showcase, inside a small fifth-floor apartment in the West Brick housing complex, Imani sat by the window, looking out over a bare concrete courtyard. The sky was gray. The city buzzed with car horns and trap beats leaking from the room next door. In front of her lay an envelope bearing the Brightmoor Conservatory logo, a thick packet containing the full scholarship papers, the admission notice, the orientation schedule, and a checklist of required documents. Each sheet was a dream flattened neatly on white paper, as if everything was ready now. But inside her, it wasn't. Imani had silenced an entire conservatory, had made people who once scoffed stop and listen. But beyond the bowed heads of the faculty, beyond the offer letter and the eyes that had shifted from curiosity to admiration, lay something she hadn't prepared for. The feeling that she didn't belong. Not because she wasn't good enough, but because she wasn't like them. She didn't talk like them, didn't dress like them, didn't come from where they came from. And most of all, she had no legacy backing her, only her mother's grit in a handful of dog-eared notebooks. Her mother, Denise, understood that, even without words. She was always the kind of woman who understood the things no one said. That evening, while Imani sat in silence, she placed a bowl of hot soup in front of her daughter and sat across from her. "They sent it, huh?" she asked. Imani nodded. "And you haven't signed?" Another nod. She looked her daughter in the eyes. "You scared?" The question wasn't sharp. It wasn't forceful, just soft enough to invite the truth. "I don't know if I can live there," Imani said, voice thick. "Not study, live. I don't get their conversations. They use words I've never heard. They wear clothes I wouldn't even know where to buy. Did you see the way they looked at me?" Denise sat quiet for a moment, then gently, "I saw. And I've been looked at like that too. When I worked at the nursing home, sometimes they'd mistake me for the janitor, even though my name was clearly printed on my badge. Every time it happened, I'd just remind myself, their eyes don't decide my worth. You don't have to live like them. You just have to live like you." Imani lowered her head. "And what about Charlotte? If I go there, I'll have to see her again. She humiliated me, remember?" "I remember," her mother replied simply. "But you're not going there for her. You're going there for the piano." That night, Imani couldn't sleep. At 2 a.m., she got up and turned on her keyboard. Her hands trembled from the cold, but she began playing the opening of Fantasia in F minor, a duet she'd once seen in a Brightmoor video last year. Back then, she watched it just to know it existed, but now she played it as if to measure herself, and in each phrase she heard one truth. No matter how many people stood around a piano, once your hands touched the keys, it was just you, and that was enough. The next morning, she carried the application to the post office, slipped it into a large envelope, signed her name in the top left corner, stamped it, and dropped it into the mailbox. Her hand trembled slightly, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from knowing. She had just stepped into a world that once shut her out, on feet blistered but unshaken. 6 days later, at Brightmoor Conservatory, when Headmistress Howell read aloud the names of the incoming freshman class, one name drew furrowed brows. Imani Brooks, full scholarship, Newark, New Jersey. While most of the students were children of music producers, New York Times journalists, and record label CEOs, the word Newark next to a full ride felt like a scratchy towel laid across a silk banquet. In the corner of the piano department office, Dr. Reed nodded at the list. "We don't admit sameness," he said to a colleague. "We admit voices that make music breathe differently." On another floor, in a private practice room, Charlotte Aldridge was playing Liszt's La Campanella, her fingers still precise but her face tense. She had heard the news about Imani's acceptance, and it stirred something deep in her, not quite envy, but unease. A fear that everything she'd believed in, effort equals reward, was now being disrupted by something she couldn't control: emotion. Imani walked through the gates of Brightmoor on orientation day. In her hand was a cloth tote bag holding 2 music notebooks, a dull pencil, and a lunchbox her mother had packed. She didn't carry confidence. She carried truth. And sometimes truth, if it burns bright enough, is the one thing people cannot ignore. The first week at Brightmoor Conservatory passed like an undercurrent. Quiet, not dramatic, but never still. Imani Brooks entered her first class with wide eyes, clutching her notebook and a pre-sharpened pencil. She didn't say much, only observed closely. No one said anything directly, but every look spoke the same sentence. "That's the girl from the showcase." A few students smiled at her, polite, surface level. Others glanced and turned away. But one person didn't look at her once: Charlotte Aldridge. In Music Theory 201, Imani sat by the window, while Charlotte sat front and center in the first row, always the first to raise her hand, always the one called on. Professor Dayton, known for his strict but fair teaching, had once said, "I don't care who your parents are. I care about hearing what you don't understand." Imani liked him. He taught without pity. But she couldn't ignore the way Charlotte looked at her every time she spoke. No mockery, no smirk, but full of scrutiny. Like Charlotte was grading her every breath, waiting for one to fall out of rhythm. At Brightmoor, the curriculum alternated between theory, private technique, and group performance classes. And it was in the group performance class that friction officially turned into collision. On Wednesday morning, in the main seminar room, Dr. Reed entered carrying a stack of sheet music. He smiled, though his face couldn't hide a certain excitement. "Everyone," he said, "this winter's showcase will feature something special. We're introducing a new format: piano duets, 4 hands, to explore how 2 musical personalities interact." The class buzzed. Imani frowned. She had seen duets before, usually performed by 2 people who trusted each other, who knew each other so well that they didn't need eye contact to anticipate each move. It wasn't something you could fake, and it wasn't something she wanted to do with Charlotte. "The pairings will be assigned based on contrasting styles and skill levels," Dr. Reed continued, his voice calm as ever. "We'll have Charlotte Aldridge and Imani Brooks." The room seemed to inhale at once. Silence compressed the space between 2 heartbeats. Charlotte turned to face Imani, really looked at her for the first time in weeks. That gaze no longer held the contempt of their first encounter, but it was full of resistance. Imani didn't look down. She narrowed her eyes, not defiance exactly, but clearly. "I'm not stepping back." After class, Charlotte approached Dr. Reed, trying to stay composed. "Are you sure this is the right pairing? She and we're not musically compatible." Dr. Reed nodded without hesitation. "Exactly. That's what makes it worth doing. You are the most technically disciplined student. Imani is the most emotionally intuitive. I want to see what happens when those things stop competing and start listening to each other." Charlotte didn't argue further. She knew pushing it would only reveal what she was trying to hide: fear. Fear that the only thing she had, perfection, could be undone by something she couldn't control: instinct. The first week of duet rehearsals was a stretch of stiffness and missteps. Practice room 3, where they were assigned, had two grand pianos placed side by side, but they only needed one, which meant they had to sit close, share a keyboard, touch hands, swap positions, shift simultaneously. All things that required a level of trust neither of them was ready to give. Imani arrived with a photocopied score covered in pencil annotations. Emotions, breath marks, phrasing. Charlotte brought a clean, handwritten score. No markings, just meticulously notated tempos. The first run-through fell apart right at the opening bars. The second, Charlotte stopped midway, accusing Imani of overpedaling. The third, Imani leaned into a swell of feeling, causing Charlotte to pull her hands back. "I think we're playing two different pieces," Charlotte said coolly. "Number. We're trying to feel two different languages," Imani replied softly. "You just don't know how to hear what isn't written in the score." Charlotte smirked. "And you? Do you even know that in Schubert, every light ending has historical meaning? Do you understand why the recapitulation is slower than the exposition? Or are you just playing by emotion?" Imani didn't react immediately, but something shifted in her eyes. She looked down at the music. "If you think every emotion needs a reason, that's why you play precisely, but never memorably." Week 2 wasn't much better, but amid the friction, something started to shift. Imani learned to yield the tempo at the right moments. Charlotte learned to ease her grip on control. One day when Charlotte tried a phrasing suggestion Imani had offered, the result echoed unexpectedly beautifully. She paused, turned her head, said nothing. But Imani knew it was the first time Charlotte admitted that emotion, too, could be logical. In the faculty lounge, Dr. Reed observed quietly through dry run footage, occasionally scribbling notes. When asked once, "Aren't you afraid those two personalities will cancel each other out?" he only smiled. "Number, I'm hoping they'll mix and create something neither of them ever dared to imagine." They still weren't friends. They didn't talk outside rehearsal. They didn't follow each other on social media. They didn't walk the same halls. But in each session, the space between them closed just a bit, not through words, but through sound. One weekend afternoon, after finishing Fantasia following nearly 2 hours of rehearsal, Charlotte didn't stand up right away. She sat still, hands resting on the keys. "I used to think you were just a fluke," she said, voice low. "But I'm starting to think maybe you're a reminder that what I've been playing all this time might not have been music." Imani didn't look over, but she nodded gently. "I used to think you were just stuck up, but now I see you've played the right way for so long, you forgot that being slightly wrong can sometimes be beautiful." No one laughed, but for the first time both left the practice room in silence, not because there was nothing left to say, but because they finally understood each other well enough not to say it. At a conservatory where everything was measured by precision and achievement, two supposed rivals were relearning the most fundamental lesson. Music doesn't begin with curriculum, it begins with listening. And to truly listen, sometimes, you have to let go of your pride. 3 weeks before the winter showcase, the atmosphere at Brightmoor began to shift. The hallways, once filled with scattered solo melodies, now echoed with duet fragments, string quartet rehearsals, and synchronized runs between pairs who never used to get along. Practice Room 3, once a silent battlefield between Imani Brooks and Charlotte Aldridge, had become a space flickering between tension and resonance. There were still disagreements, still clashes, but the retries no longer felt forced. They were trying again, because they wanted to, because they were curious about what might happen if they each gave in. Just a little. Imani often arrived 15 minutes early, not to rehearse more, but to breathe alone in the room. She had never said this to anyone, but every time her hands touched the piano here, it still felt like borrowing a world that didn't belong to her. The velvet chairs, the zone lighting system, the piano polished nightly. None of it resembled the place she came from, where practicing early meant convincing a janitor to unlock the room and wiping dust off the keys with her own handkerchief. Charlotte always arrived on time, never early, never late. But recently she started walking in with her coat unbuttoned, water bottle in hand, eyes less guarded. Sometimes when she found Imani playing something outside the assigned piece, she didn't interrupt. She just stood there listening quietly. Once, after hearing Imani rephrase the opening of Fantasia by altering the left-hand arpeggio, she said, "That's nice, but if you keep the same tempo, the climax won't have enough room to grow." Imani smiled. "Then we create a new climax with something else." "Like what?" Charlotte asked. Imani turned on the bench. "Like pressing one unexpected note, right when no one sees it coming." Charlotte sat beside her and opened the score. "Let's try it." For the first time, they didn't speak as rivals, but as musicians, workshopping an arrangement, not to win, but to find a shared way to tell the story. Dr. Reed began visiting their practice room every other day. He didn't say much, just listened, took notes, occasionally closed his eyes. Once, after Charlotte had left early for chamber ensemble class, he approached Imani. "You're beginning to change how she sees the world," he said. Imani blinked. "You mean through music?" "No," Dr. Reed replied. "I mean people." Back in their Newark apartment, Imani's mother, Denise, still worked night shifts, still set out dinner for her daughter, but had begun taping Imani's photos to the fridge. The showcase invitation, a picture of the Steinway, a candid shot taken from behind as Imani played Chopin. She didn't talk much about what was happening, but one night when Imani came home late, she found a note. "Keep playing. You don't need permission to dream big." At Brightmoor, people started to notice. The whispers weren't skeptical anymore. They were expectant. Something was coming. For years, the Winter Showcase had been a stage for solo showboating. But this time, rumors were swirling about a special duet between the Steinway Girl and the Queen of Technique. That's what they were calling them, as if they were characters in a play. In Practice Room 3, when they ran the development section of Fantasia for the 12th time, they were so in sync that neither had to look up to know when the other was switching pedals. Imani's hand now locked into Charlotte's rhythm, and Charlotte, for the first time, stopped forcing phrasing into structure and let it float the way Imani guided it. That evening, after rehearsal, Charlotte lingered a few minutes longer. As Imani packed up her things, Charlotte hesitated before speaking. "Next week, my mother's coming to the performance." "Good," Imani replied, not looking up. "Not exactly," Charlotte said with a faint laugh. "She's always thought I should only play solo. Duets are concession." Imani paused, then turned to her. "My mom," she said, "just wants to see me touch a real piano. Everything else, she says, is a bonus." Charlotte went silent. After a long pause, she whispered, "I wish my dreams were that simple." Imani didn't respond, but that night back home, she sat at her electric keyboard and played Fantasia. By herself. She played Charlotte's part too. And she realized Charlotte's part was harder than she'd thought. And for the first time, she silently gave thanks for having Charlotte next to her. Sometimes the most powerful performances begin with two people learning how to listen. And sometimes the real music starts long before the curtain rises. If you felt the tension, the growth, and the quiet transformation between Imani and Charlotte, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that hit all the right notes. Your support helps these stories find the hearts they're meant for. The night of Brightmoor's Winter Showcase took place in the main concert hall, the Aldridge Hall, named after Charlotte's great-grandfather, the conservatory's first benefactor. Every inch of the venue radiated a quiet authority, from the thick velvet stage curtains to the walnut floor glistening under warm golden light, to the guest chairs marked with embossed name cards. It was the kind of room that made even seasoned musicians feel like they were being tested. Imani sat backstage, hands resting on her lap, eyes down on the pair of rounded-toe black shoes issued by the conservatory's performance wardrobe. She wasn't used to the outfit. A simple yet elegant black dress, her hair neatly pinned back, no jewelry. But for that reason, she felt exposed. Nothing to hide behind. Only the music and the truth. Charlotte sat 5 meters away across the room. The distance between them was no longer the same as in the beginning. She adjusted the back strap of her dress, not looking over, but the reflection in the mirror revealed she was far from distracted. They both knew tonight wasn't just a performance, it was a statement that two opposing worlds could tell one story together, with no winner or loser. Imani's mother sat in the third row, surrounded by parents in velvet blazers, Italian overcoats, and silk scarves printed with the names of European conservatories. Denise wore her old brown coat, a hand-knit scarf, and held her phone in her lap, not to record but to capture the final moment once it was done. In the front row, Charlotte's mother, Veronica Aldridge, arrived just before the finale. She moved with the ease of someone used to attention. Without acknowledging anyone, she sat down, put on her glasses, flipped the program open, and stopped at Finale. Schubert Fantasia in F minor, four hands. Performed by Charlotte Aldridge and Imani Brooks. Her brow furrowed slightly, as if the second name was a typo. The house lights dimmed. The noise of cameras, footsteps, and whispers faded. Headmistress Howell stepped onto the stage and calmly introduced the program. But when she reached the final piece, she paused longer than usual. And finally, she said, we present a special performance, not just for its musical difficulty, but for the journey behind it. Two students, one traditional, one unconventional. Two approaches, two worlds, one composition. Please welcome Charlotte Aldridge, and Imani Brooks. Polite applause followed, not yet roaring. The spotlight fell. The two girls walked onto the stage. Matching dresses, identical posture, and one final glance exchanged before placing their hands on the keyboard. No dialogue, no defiance. Just breathe. The first notes floated into the hall, soft, like wind gliding over water. The opening of Fantasia is a shy conversation between two voices, left and right, dark and bright. Charlotte began, sharp, precise, as always. Imani followed, fluid, flexible, like smoke merging into flame. The early sections were flawless, every note clean. But what drew the audience forward in their seats wasn't precision. It was the intangible, emotion. At the central development section, where hands cross over and rhythms are passed back and forth, they didn't look at each other, but their timing was uncannily aligned. Imani could feel Charlotte's breath shift through her shoulder. Charlotte sensed Imani's faint hesitation at the key like a soft break. Their crescendos surged with daring control. Their pianissimos fell with total trust. In the crowd, a man live streaming lowered his phone. A faculty member stopped clicking his pen. Even Charlotte's mother, who had never applauded more than 3 claps for anyone, tilted her head. Imani's mother sat motionless, but her eyes followed every movement of her daughter, like watching a child take their first steps outside familiar walls. The final segment of the piece was the hardest, repeating runs with overlapping hands, notorious even among professionals. Many advanced students avoided it, fearing pedal mismatches or hand collisions, but they pushed forward. When the climax arrived, something unexpected happened. Charlotte yielded the phrasing to Imani, an unplanned decision. But Imani caught it instantly. She carried the final passage on feeling, not destroying structure, but adding dimension. And Charlotte followed, not resisting, but blending in. For the first time, she wasn't playing for perfection. She was playing to hear the story told in someone else's way. The final chord landed, not abruptly, but like a gentle goodbye. The hall held its breath, and then burst open. Applause thundered. Some stood, some whistled softly, some turned to ask, "Who's the girl on the left?" And when someone in the 4th row, a white student, shouted Imani's name, not her mother, not someone from Newark, everything changed. Charlotte bowed. Imani bowed too. They didn't look at each other. But as they walked back into the wings, Charlotte's hand brushed against Imani's. Just once. Lightly. No one saw. But Imani felt it. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a thank you. It was an acknowledgement that needed no words. Backstage, Dr. Reed was waiting. He said only one thing as they stepped down. That was the duet that made me believe in arts education again. No more. No less. That night, back in her small apartment, Imani turned on her electric keyboard. But she didn't play. She just sat there, remembering the spotlight on the polished keys, the breath of the girl beside her, and the moment the world listened without needing her name. She didn't win. She didn't lose. She had sung a song only the outcast could truly understand, and for the first time, it echoed, "Not alone." After the performance, Imani Brooks's name echoed through the halls of Brightmoor Conservatory like the melody of the Fantasia she had just performed. Her name appeared in the school newsletter under the headline, "When Talent Meets Courage, a performance that redefined excellence." A short post on the Parents Association blog praised the duet as a breath of fresh air for a program long dominated by rigid technicality. A jazz faculty member emailed to invite Imani to join a cross-genre project blending classical piano and soul. Even a small piano company in New York mailed her a practice pedal set for home use. But not every gaze was gentle. Monday morning, as Imani walked into harmony class, someone deliberately let the door bump her shoulder. Not hard, but enough to send a message. When she sat down, a classmate, Miles, sighed and muttered, "Funny. Took me 4 years to earn a spot in the showcase. Some people just need one emotional stunt." Imani didn't respond, but the comment spread around the table like dissonant notes in an overcalculated harmony. She wasn't surprised. She knew the world doesn't change after just one performance. But what she hadn't expected was Charlotte's silence. 3 days after the showcase, during solo practice, Charlotte didn't show up. She emailed Dr. Reed citing a minor wrist injury. A week later, she was also absent from group rehearsal. Some students whispered she was on a mental health break. Others said she was training privately in New York with her old instructor to rebalance emotionally. But Imani sensed something else, something quieter, deeper. That weekend, walking past the East Campus, where Aldridge Hall stood, Imani saw Charlotte sitting alone in the back garden. No performance dress, no designer labels, just jeans, a gray sweatshirt, and a cup of cold tea in her hands. Her eyes stared into the distance, unfocused. Imani hesitated, then walked over. Not out of curiosity, but because she felt she had to. Not as a rival, but as someone who knew what it meant to feel alone in the middle of applause. "Your wrist feeling better?" Imani asked. Charlotte didn't look up right away. "Not sure. Maybe it was never really hurt," she replied. Then raising her eyes, voice hoarse, "You know what's worse than being hated?" Imani stayed quiet. Charlotte answered herself. "Being ignored. When I played Liszt, they called me a technical genius. When you played Chopin, they called you an emotional genius. But when we played together, they only remembered your name." Imani didn't reply, but it stung, not out of guilt, but because, for the first time, she saw something she'd never allowed herself to consider. That to gain a place, maybe she'd stepped on someone else's fracture. "You think I was afraid of you?" Charlotte continued, her voice almost defiant. "I'm afraid of what you represent. I'm afraid that one day everything I've practiced since I was 3 won't be enough. I'm afraid that emotion, the one thing I can't buy, will become the thing they start looking for." Imani sat down beside her. "I'm afraid too. I'm afraid they only clap out of pity. Afraid that if I miss one note, they'll go back to calling me that community center girl." They didn't look at each other, but the space between them was no longer dramatic tension. It was acknowledgement. Imani stood ready to leave when Charlotte called out, "Do you think we were ever enemies?" Imani gave a soft laugh for the first time. I think we were just two people, trying to survive differently." Charlotte nodded, slowly, then for the first time asked without bravado, "At the showcase, you slowed down the ending, didn't you?" Imani smiled. "Yeah, I wanted the audience to breathe. I could feel them about to cry." "I didn't realize it then," Charlotte said, "but I followed you without resisting." "Maybe that was the first time you listened to someone without needing a reason," Imani replied, then walked away. On her way back, Imani received an email from Dr. Reed. "I've sent the showcase video to the Young Classical Artists Foundation. They'd like to meet you next month. Get ready." She sat on a bench outside her dorm and exhaled, not from exhaustion, but because she knew she was about to enter a world even farther than the stage that night. And Charlotte was still standing at a crossroads with no name, where, for the first time, someone realized that titles can't protect you from truth. 3 months after the performance, something unnamed had begun to shift inside Brightmoor. Everyone could feel it. Class discussions began revolving around personal voice rather than just academic schools. Syllabi were updated to include open discussions. Teachers who once only praised technical precision now asked, "How do you feel when you play this passage?" Internal rehearsals, once tight-lipped and tense, now carried honest exchanges. The spark behind this new energy wasn't always named aloud, but no one denied it. Imani Brooks and her unlikely duet with Charlotte Aldridge had set it in motion. Dr. Reed, once a staunch guardian of structure, became the first to propose an entirely new spring term initiative, Bridging Traditions, a performance series pairing classically trained students with instinctual players. In a closed meeting with the school board, he said, "We can teach technique, but no one teaches the courage to tell a story. The real problem is, we stopped listening to those who tell stories differently." Not everyone approved. Some parents wrote letters of complaint, arguing that the program dilutes professional standards and celebrates personality over pedigree. At the March Parent Assembly, Veronica Aldridge stood up and said coldly, "I'm concerned that my daughter, who's trained for 16 years, is being placed on equal footing with someone who learned by ear." The room went silent for several seconds, but this time, Headmistress Howell didn't dodge the moment. "We're not leveling," she said. "We're expanding. And if art becomes nothing but a report card, then it will die within the very rubric it's built around." Meanwhile, Charlotte began attending classes regularly again. She didn't walk alone anymore. Though not side by side, she and Imani now often exited the rehearsal rooms together after their weekly duet sessions, no longer marked mandatory. One afternoon, Dr. Reed summoned them to the conservatory's recording studio. On the table lay the sheet music to Shostakovich's Concertino for 2 pianos. "I've entered your names for the Winter Music Invitational in Chicago," he said, "and I want you to perform this piece, not as students, but as 2 artists making it your own." Charlotte blinked. "This is a dual piece." Dr. Reed nodded. "Exactly, and I want you to redefine it." The weeks that followed were intense. The Shostakovich Concertino was no Schubert. It wasn't tender. It didn't seek to please. It was a battlefield of 2 pianos locked in dialogue. Some passages sparred like arguments. Others breathed in unison after holding tension too long. This was no longer about who followed whom. It was about the question, how do you coexist with someone different from you without erasing yourself? Imani brought more than technique. She brought her past rage, her rejections, the skeptical glances that still trailed her in the concert halls. Charlotte carried a life built on being right, always right, and the unbearable pressure of realizing that being right might no longer be enough. During one rehearsal, they fell nearly half a beat out of sync at the climax. Imani stopped. Charlotte stopped too. No one spoke. Then Charlotte said first for the first time, "I played too fast. I forgot this piece needs space." Imani looked at her and quietly replied, "And I forgot that not everyone is used to letting go." No one laughed, but for the first time they both looked at the sheet music, not to fix but to understand. On the day of the invitational, the stage was larger. The audience was bigger. Among the attendees were representatives from Juilliard, the Curtis Institute, and 2 international music foundations. Charlotte stood before the mirror, adjusting her sleeves, glancing toward Imani sitting with eyes closed on the bench. "You nervous?" Imani asked. Charlotte nodded. "You?" "No," Imani smiled. "I panicked last week. Now, I've let go." Charlotte laughed. Her first in months. When they stepped on stage and the spotlight fell, the opening notes of Shostakovich's Concertino rang out. No one in the audience could predict what was coming, because what they were hearing wasn't 2 players anymore. It was a new entity, fierce, layered, aching, but unbroken. A piece that broke the old mold. A living truth that sometimes, to create something unprecedented, you have to stand beside the one you once feared, once dismissed, or never understood. When the final note fell, the audience rose. Not because it was perfect, but because they had witnessed something rare. 2 opposites, not blended, but accepted. As they exited the stage, Charlotte said nothing. But backstage, she turned to Imani. "Did you notice? In that section, I followed your phrasing." Imani replied softly, "I know. I was waiting for you to slow down." Dr. Reed didn't say much. He simply handed them the official letter from the Young Classical Artists Foundation. "We'd like you to perform this piece again in London." No one answered, but in their eyes, for the first time, there were no more borders. Monday morning in Brightmoor's faculty hall usually smelled of hand-roasted coffee and freshly printed paper. But today that aroma was overpowered by the quiet tension threaded between the rows of chairs. On Headmistress Adelaide Howell's desk sat a nearly 60-page binder, its light gray hardcover embossed with gold lettering that read, "The Horizon Module, a restructuring proposal for music education." Inside was an ambitious yet unassuming plan, not just to tweak lesson schedules or redistribute technique hours, but to alter the root, the value system. "We've trained brilliant technicians," Howell began, her voice calm and grounded, "but what the world needs now are storytellers." Some faculty nodded slightly. Others furrowed their brows. A few folded their hands, but none openly objected. She flipped to Section 3, the first mentorship triad in the Horizon model. 3 names appeared: Marcus Reed, Charlotte Aldridge, Imani Brooks. Whispers rippled. No one questioned Marcus. He had upheld the conservatory for over 30 years. Charlotte, 3-time national winner, no objections there. But the third name drew a few coughs, not hostile, but unsure how to react. Imani Brooks, a girl without a formal conservatory background, no private instructors, no competition records. The only thing she had was a performance that had silenced an entire institution. "She's only 17, said Professor Van from the Chamber Music Department. "Are we seriously letting a student teach?" Dr. Reed answered without glancing at his notes. "I said the same thing about an 18-year-old student in 1996. Her name was Charlotte Aldridge, and she proved me wrong." The air loosened a bit, but tension lingered. "We're not asking for immediate agreement," Howell continued. "We're asking for the openness to hear a different movement within the same symphony. And somehow, Miss Brooks has written that movement without using our sheet." No further objections, but no applause either. At Brightmoor, justice didn't arrive with banners. It came slowly, and in silence. The next morning, an official announcement appeared on the Academy portal. Brightmoor launches the Horizon program, a mentorship blending technical discipline and emotional intuition, open to students from all backgrounds. People talked. Some cheered, some doubted. But one thing was clear: something unprecedented was beginning. Room 307, once an unused tutoring space, became the most crowded room every Thursday afternoon. Charlotte stood at the front, lecturing on phrasing control in Debussy's performance practice. Imani stood beside the board, annotating pedal points, not in notes but in words. Breathe, compress, release, pull back. A student raised their hand. "It feels like this piece is telling a story where the narrator keeps hesitating." Charlotte asked, "Where do you sense the hesitation?" "The modulation from tonic to minor dominant," Imani chimed in. "Hesitation can come from fear, or maybe from holding something back that hasn't found the courage to be said yet." The room fell quiet for a few seconds. Maybe an understanding, maybe still processing, but no one looked away. Outside the academy, reactions began appearing on musician forums. A clip from the Shostakovich duet was reshared by a respected pianist account. "This is no longer just 2 students. It's 2 value systems learning to coexist." At home, Imani's mother, Denise, was making afternoon tea when her daughter received a letter from the organization Young Artists for Social Harmony. "We invite Miss Imani Brooks to lead a national workshop titled Telling Stories Through the Keys at this year's conference." She set her teacup down and exhaled, not in triumph, but like someone who'd once been left outside the room, now formally invited to sit at the table. No knocking required. One late afternoon, after most students had gone, Charlotte stayed behind to adjust the pedal for a younger student who had just left. Imani stood nearby, tidying up handouts. Charlotte spoke, not looking up. "I used to think emotions didn't count because they couldn't be measured, so they had no value. But I was wrong. What can't be measured is often the only thing that makes people stay." Imani replied, "I used to think technique was what made people distant, but when used right, it's wings." Charlotte looked up, met Imani's eyes. No frost, no pride, just person-to-person, understanding. That evening, Headmistress Howell drafted a report to the board of sponsors. "Brightmoor is restructuring. not just its curriculum, but how we define talent. She ended the letter with one sentence. Talent doesn't always enter through the front door, but when it speaks, you can't pretend you didn't hear it. And on a level deeper, where no one needs to shout it, justice had arrived. Not with an apology from the old guard, not with Charlotte bowing her head to say, I was wrong, but with this simple truth. Today she was teaching, beside the very girl she once told, don't touch what you can't afford. The following spring, Brightmoor held a new kind of concert titled New Resonance, an annual program redesigned around the philosophy of the Horizon module. Students were no longer sorted by competition achievements, but by themes of expression. The lineup wasn't determined by reputation, but by artistic dialogue between unique voices. And for the first time, first-year students were allowed to perform alongside their mentors, in duets, improvisations, and even open performances with no conductor. Among the listed pieces, two drew quiet intrigue from the board. 1. Voices from the Edge, performed by freshman Mariah Torres from Jackson Heights, alongside Imani Brooks. 2. The Mechanics of Emotion, a performance by Ethan Vance, a former student of Charlotte, reimagining Beethoven with electronic textures. No one expected these performances to be the night's highlight, but they were, because in those moments it became clear the next generation wasn't learning from curriculum. They were learning from people, and the two who had opened the way were Imani and Charlotte. During rehearsal, Mariah, a petite Latina girl with a cropped haircut and a voice that dropped every time someone asked if she was sure she belonged here, turned to Imani and asked, "Did you ever feel like you didn't belong on this stage?" Imani answered without pause, "I still do sometimes. But I've learned some things don't belong because they were made to break every mold that exists." Mariah didn't say anything, but right after rehearsal, she texted her mom. "Mom, I don't have to become someone else to be heard. I just have to tell my story right." The piece Voices from the Edge opened with a short solo by Mariah, an original composition about winter nights in Queens, waiting in a subway station while her mom worked the late shift. Then Imani joined, not to steal the stage, but to lift that story into a wordless conversation. The audience didn't hear two pianos. They heard two childhoods layered together, one past healing, one present being seen. Charlotte sat in the second row watching in silence. She didn't look at Imani, but at Mariah, and for the first time she saw what looked like an Imani 2.0, only stronger because this one began with support, not by having to break down the door. At the same time, Ethan, Charlotte's former student, stepped up for The Mechanics of Emotion. He didn't play standard repertoire. Instead, he remixed a passage from Beethoven's Sonata No. 32, blending in synth counterpoint and tapping rhythmic patterns directly on the piano frame. The audience looked puzzled at first, but when he ended with a three-note chord progression echoing last year's Fantasia, the observant ones realized it was a salute from a new generation to two mentors who never fit the mold. After the show, Dr. Reed, now serving as a Horizon advisor, called Imani and Charlotte aside. "Did you see what just happened?" he asked. Imani answered first. "A generation that doesn't have to choose sides," Charlotte added, "because they got to hear both sides from the start." He nodded. "When I first started teaching, we trained players. Later, we trained performers. But now, I believe you're training storytellers, and the world has never needed them more." A few days later, a journalist from American Classical Journal published a feature. Brightmoor, once known for its conservatism, is now the model for balancing technique and identity. But what sets it apart is this: they gave the mic to the ones they once left outside the room and let them lead. In the Academy Library, a new corkboard was mounted on the wall. It displayed photos of the Horizon mentors, one of Charlotte adjusting a student's hand position, and another of Imani smiling as she pointed to a rhythmic break in Mariah's score. No captions were needed. Students recognized them without introduction. That night in a small apartment west of campus, Imani sat with her mother, re-watching the performance on their old laptop. Denise slowly folded a blanket and said, "I used to wish someone had taught me to believe in things I couldn't see, like that my daughter would become a music teacher." Imani smiled. "You didn't need to believe. You just needed to let me believe." Her mother nodded. And now you're doing that. For others. On the wall of practice room 3, the one that had once been the battleground of two worlds, someone had written a line in white chalk. If you can't hear the other voice, maybe it's not because it's wrong. Maybe it's playing pianissimo. There was no signature, but no one needed to ask who it came from. That morning, Brightmoor had no major event, no live stream, no press conference, no new program launch. Just an ordinary Monday in spring, when the oak tree still cast its shadow across the stone corridor, when the early season birds still sang atop the concert hall dome, and when the sounds of pianos from practice rooms still overlapped, clashed, and occasionally refused to align. But something was different. Practice room 3, the space once unofficially known as the special room for outsiders, now bore a new sign: Horizon Room, for stories that begin differently. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, just a single line carved into wood, dedicated to the ones who were told they didn't belong. Inside, Imani sat with a group of first-year students, none from major cities. None owned a piano at home. One was the daughter of a truck driver from Akron. Another had transferred after being bullied for playing Chopin in a hip-hop school. And one, named Eli, couldn't read traditional sheet music, but could replicate a Bach passage after hearing it once. Imani didn't assign exercises. She simply asked, "If music were a refuge today, what would you be hiding from?" It wasn't in any curriculum, but it became the lesson. Across the hall, Charlotte was rehearsing with students prepping for elite conservatory auditions. She was still strict, still demanded every note be exact. But something had changed. After a student played, she no longer critiqued immediately. She asked, "Are you telling something you've kept hidden?" If they answered, "I'm not sure," she'd ask them to play it again, not to find mistakes, but to dare to speak through the keys. In the hallway outside, Dr. Reed passed by. He didn't enter, but he paused, glanced through the glass, then kept walking, tea in hand, nodding gently like a man who just heard an old melody return. A month later, Brightmoor released its annual report. Inside was an excerpt from a freshman's essay, someone who had never taken a formal music exam before arriving. "Thank you for not asking me what I've studied. Thank you for asking me what I've heard." The quote was italicized, unsigned. But when Headmistress Howell read it aloud at the faculty meeting, everyone knew where it came from. As for Imani, she didn't become more famous, didn't appear on TV, didn't land a global concert tour, but she was invited to guest teach at 4 other conservatories, not for her resume, but because people wanted to understand how a girl once humiliated at the piano became the one an entire system now pointed to as the future. And Charlotte, writing in an academic journal, left this line: "I used to think justice was a voice from the podium. I now know it's the person beside you, playing every note, to remind you you're not alone." There was no photo, no hashtags, but the piece was shared thousands of times across conservatory forums. One reader left a new line beneath it: "This is what reconciliation sounds like." That night, as lights dimmed across campus and students trickled out, Imani remained in the Horizon Room. She played a short piece, not Schubert, not Chopin, just something of her own, a melody for herself, one with the low notes of memory, the bright notes of forgiveness, and a pause in the middle, long enough for the listener to truly listen. Charlotte entered later, carrying 2 cups of black tea. No words. She placed 1 cup down, sat beside Imani, quiet. They didn't play. They didn't need to, because sometimes the music is already written, and the rest is to hear the echo. If you've ever been told you didn't belong, remember, some of the most beautiful sounds come from the places once told to be silent, and someday you, without raising your voice, will make the world stop and listen. Imani didn't take home a medal. She didn't have a viral moment. No standing ovation changed her life overnight. What she gained was far greater. She claimed a seat at a table that was never meant for someone like her. She earned a voice in a room where only grade books and blazers once spoke. And the most important part? She didn't just earn respect, she redefined it, in a way that made the system itself transform. Because when a girl like Imani walks into a space that once said she didn't belong, and instead of backing away, She sits down, places her hands on the keys, and starts to play. That's not just bravery. That's a quiet revolution, one that can't be ignored. And truthfully, this story shouldn't feel extraordinary. A talented child being heard should be ordinary. But in a world where potential is still ranked by zip code, skin tone, or the price of your shoes, that kind of ordinary becomes tragically rare. And that's what should move us and anger us. If you smiled when that girl played, if your eyes welled up when her mother stood in the crowd, or if you clenched your fists when someone said, "Don't touch what you can't afford," then that feeling is exactly what this story was written to awaken. Because talent doesn't require the right address. Passion doesn't need tuition. And sometimes the person a room underestimates the most becomes the only one it listens to. And now I want to ask you, have you ever been told you're not good enough? Have you ever had to prove your worth in a place that assumed you had none? Drop your story in the comments below, because we're listening. Truly. And if you believe the world needs more stories like Imani's, ones that are brave, unfiltered, and deeply human, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story that might make you cry or stand up and clap. Because somewhere out there, another Imani is sitting at an old piano, hands trembling, wondering if anyone will hear her. This time, let us be the ones to say, yes, we're listening.